Okay, let's get into this. For today's deep dive, we're looking at something. Well, it's much heavier than just diplomatic protocol or state dinners. We're unpacking a set of sources that describe a real breakdown of what some analysts are calling civilizational infrastructure.
And that phrase, civilizational infrastructure, is, I think, central to our mission here today. The analysis we've looked at suggests that the entire post-World War II international order, it rested on a shared diplomatic culture.
A culture with specific behaviors, right?
Exactly. Things like restraint, a kind of professionalized statecraft, and, a fundamental respect for procedural norms, for the rules.
But the sources are pretty clear that this culture has, well, visibly eroded. I mean, looking at where we are now, January 2026, the whole tone of diplomacy has shifted.
Oh, completely.
It's
Confrontational now. It's transactional,
thankfully not.
deeply personalized.
And almost contemptuous of the old rules.
Right, so we really have to understand the mechanisms behind this collapse. We're going to try and unpack the big structural drivers, technology, economics, power shifts, and then look at the real-world consequences with examples from 2024 and 2025.
And the big question we're posing for you, the listener, is whether the actual behavioral foundations of international order are fracturing. I mean, this is about more than just politics. It's about the very things that are supposed to stop rivalry from becoming, a catastrophe. So to really understand what we're losing, maybe we should start with how this all began. The sources are emphatic that the generation that built the post-1945 system, they weren't just being polite for the sake of it, they had just lived through 2 world wars.
That collective trauma is the absolute key ingredient here. It created this deep consensus among the elites that unchecked nationalism was, frankly, a civilizational threat.
So restraint wasn't a choice, it was a necessity.
It was necessity born from catastrophe. It wasn't about weakness or some kind of moral superiority. It was pure survival.
Wait, so not about being nice, but about survival. That totally flips the idea of diplomatic politeness on its head. If it was a survival strategy, what were the practical structures they built to make sure leaders actually followed it?
That's the thing. It was institutionalized. Foreign ministries, they cultivated this specific class of professional diplomats, specialists. And crucially, these people were insulated, not completely, but insulated from the day-to-day populist pressures.
And this professional class gave the system some stability.
It gave it 3 critical things. First, as you might guess, was continuity.
Right. So relationships could outlast any single president or prime minister.
Exactly. An ambassador could have a decade-long relationship with their counterpart no matter who was in office. Second was expertise. I mean, complex things like arms control, you needed specialists.
And the third one, predictability. That feels like the most important one, especially when tensions are high.
Absolutely. Predictability just reduces uncertainty. It meant you knew the channels would stay open, that the messaging would follow a certain structure, and this allowed for quiet, back-channel communication. It let leaders manage crises away from the public glare.
Which is just incredible because the sources say this even held up during the worst parts of the Cold War. It wasn't about Washington and Moscow being friends.
Not at all. It was about bounding the conflict. Adversaries still followed these unwritten rules. Channels stayed open. Language was measured. Leaders avoided personalizing it. Civility, in that context, was basically just risk management. When you have nuclear weapons, a miscalculation is potentially existential.
Okay, so let's fast forward to today. That whole system seems to be under massive strain. If the old way was built on trauma and insulation, what's tearing it down now? The sources point to 4 big drivers. Let's start with the one we all feel, the digital degradation of discourse.
Right. Digital media has just collapsed the distance between what's domestic politics and what's foreign policy. Diplomacy isn't happening in quiet rooms anymore. It's happening in real time. And the algorithms, they reward outrage and performative toughness. It's becoming political theater.
That shift is so palpable. The source material draws a direct line to elections, like the 2024 U.S. election, where TikTok became a central campaign tool. And at the same time, you see the global print ad market dropping almost 40% between 2019 and 2024. The old gatekeepers are gone.
And the consequences are, well, they're severe. You get this compression of complex issues into a soundbite. A statement a diplomat could once clarify now lives online forever, fueling these endless reaction cycles. And maybe the worst part is this massive audience confusion, where a message meant for a domestic base hits an international capital, and they have to take it literally.
So if the digital world is the delivery mechanism for this speed and outrage, what's actually fueling the aggressive content? That brings us to driver B populism.
Yeah, populist leaders, their whole model relies on aggressive rhetoric against some kind of enemy, foreign or domestic. And in that environment, Compromise, the actual heartbeat of diplomacy, is framed as betrayal, as weakness.
And it's not just talk, is it? It becomes structural. The sources talk about the personalization of foreign policy, where a leader's bravado replaces institutional memory. You get loyalty-based appointments instead of experts.
And breaking the norms, that becomes proof that you're telling it like it is, not that you're unstable or incompetent. The irony, of course, is the more personal it gets, the less predictable the state becomes.
Okay, let's shift to the economy. Driver C is the fragmentation of globalization, what some are calling weaponized interdependence.
Yes, this move towards protectionism, using sanctions for everything, it's basically turned diplomacy into a form of economic warfare management.
And the scale is just staggering. The sources point out that by May 2025, the Trump administration had put at least 10% tariffs on, what is it, $2.3 trillion of goods. That's 71% of all imports, using emergency powers to do it.
It's an incredible number. And the consequences, it amounted to an average tax hike of $1,200 per U.S. household in 2025. But here's the key diplomatic point. China didn't just give in. They adapted. They rerouted trade through Southeast Asia, through Mexico.
So when you weaponize the economy like that, trust just collapses. You assume your rival is already planning their next economic attack.
Exactly. And the incentive for restraint just evaporates. Finally, we have driver D, the big power transition. The world is moving from clear American leadership to, well, something else. Genuine multipolarity, maybe a U.S.-China bipolar contest. The point is, the rules of the road are now up for grabs.
And you can see this physically, right? The sources had that fascinating data on diplomatic footprints. China now actually has more diplomatic posts than the U.S. across Africa, East Asia, the Pacific Islands, Central Asia. It's 274 to 271.
And that's not just symbolic. It reflects a deep philosophical challenge. Revisionist powers see the old norms on trade, on intervention, as tools of Western dominance. So without a shared agreement on what's acceptable behavior, diplomacy just becomes pure power signaling. There are no rules.
So abandoning these norms isn't just a style choice. It has real, measurable consequences. Let's talk about risk A, escalation, and strategic miscalculation.
This is probably the most dangerous part. When threats are routine, when insults are normal, you introduce this massive ambiguity. Adversaries can't tell the difference between a real red line and just, rhetorical noise for the home audience.
Right. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he warned about this exact thing in Ukraine, losing that fragile diplomatic momentum.
Exactly. And when the off-ramps are closed, the risk of an accident just skyrockets. We saw several near misses in 2024 and 25 that really highlight this. Russian aircraft violating airspace over Poland and Romania, aggressive U.S. naval actions in the Venezuela crisis, incidents in contested waters, all because the signaling was so unclear.
Then there's risk B, which is this institutional hollowing. Multilateral institutions like the UN, they still exist on paper, but they stop functioning.
They persist in form, but not in function. The UN Security Council is facing a severe crisis of relevance.
A really clear example was Darfur. In November 2024, Russia vetoed a Security Council resolution that was just calling for more protection for civilians.
The institution is paralyzed by these rivalries.
And the sources point out this damaging feedback loop, where we apply one set of rules to Ukraine, but a totally different set to Gaza or Sudan.
And that selective application of the law, it undermines the legitimacy of the entire system for everyone. It makes it all look like a sham.
To see how this works, let's look at a couple of case studies. First, the U.S.-Venezuela crisis in 2024-2025. This seems to be a total replacement of diplomacy with just confrontation.
It really is. After the disputed 2024 election, direct communication channels were just officially closed. All that was left was public shouting. And the actions were severe. A $50 million reward for Maduro's capture, a 25% punitive tariff on any country buying Venezuelan oil.
At stripping Venezuelan nationals in the U.S. of legal protections. The sources called it economic siege warfare and public vilification. It's what's left when you take diplomacy off the table.
Exactly. The other case, Sudan, shows the tragic human cost of this breakdown. By December 2024, parts of Darfur and Kordofan were literally slipping into famine.
And the failure there wasn't just inaction, it was diplomatic dysfunction.
Right. Instead of one coordinated effort, you had competing mediation tracks from Western, Arab, African countries, and they were undermining each other. So that paralysis we talked about, it translated directly into starvation.
Where do we go from here? The sources are really sober on this. A full return to that post-1945 ethos, it seems unlikely. The conditions that created it, that shared trauma, elite insulation, Western dominance, they're just gone.
Right, so if we can't get 1945 back, the goal has to be something different. The analysts call it functional equivalence.
Yeah.
It's about finding ways to make the system work again, even if we don't agree on ideology. Selective reconstruction.
Okay. And the sources lay out 5 potential pathways. The first one seems foundational: reprofessionalization. It notes the U.S. State Department actually started this in 2024, hiring its largest classes of Foreign Service officers in over a decade.
This investment and expertise is so vital. They created specialized bodies like China House, the Bureau of Cyberspace, and Digital Policy. It's a signal that institutional memory and patient analysis are being valued again over, just political loyalty.
Pathway 2 is technical diplomacy insulation. I like this idea. It's about protecting cooperation on problems where everyone wins, like climate change or disease surveillance.
Or managing space debris. Things that are just non-zero-sum problems that you have to solve together, regardless of who's angry at whom. It creates a reason to keep talking.
Pathway 3 is norm reinforcement among the major powers. Basically, managed competition.
You don't need trust, but you need mutual recognition that unmanaged conflict is bad for everybody. The planned April 2026 state visit to Beijing is a good example. Even intense rivals see the value in keeping those high-level channels open.
And Pathway 4 gets at the psychology, reframing civility as strength. The idea that restraint isn't weakness, it's smart power management.
Unrestrained unilateralism often just backfires. The sources note that courts have ruled some of those emergency tariffs illegal. Measured diplomacy, backed by real interests, is almost always more effective than big theatrical gestures.
Finally, Pathway 5, the stabilizing role of middle powers. So when the big powers are deadlocked, other countries step in.
Exactly. States like Qatar, Turkey, India. They can leverage their unique positions to broker dialogue and reinforce the very norms the great powers are breaking. They fill that vacuum.
So the conclusion here feels sobering, but not hopeless. This erosion of norms is real, it's structural, and it has huge consequences for global security and stability.
Right. We can't recreate 1945. But the goal has to be rebuilding a diplomatic culture that can manage rivalry without tipping into catastrophe.
And that brings it all back to the beginning, that civilized behavior from the past. It really was survival strategy.
And in an era of nuclear weapons, AI, climate change, these are all existential challenges. Abandoning diplomatic discipline seems like a tremendous gamble.
So the reconstruction has to be selective. It has to focus on functional restraint that actually reduces the risk of miscalculation. But here's the challenge the sources leave us with, and I think it's the core of the problem. The cumulative effect of all these failures is that leaders now just assume agreements will be broken, which makes them quicker to use force. So if civility is a survival strategy, what incentives do you see today that could possibly move a nation away from this performative hostility and back toward measured restraint? That's the question we all have to grapple with.